What's the most shocking thing a dying person ever confessed to you? I was 24 when I got the call that my great-aunt Beatrice was dying. We'd never been close. She was my grandfather's sister, a reclusive woman who lived alone in a sprawling Victorian house on the outskirts of town. Growing up, she'd been the strange relative we visited twice a year out of obligation. She'd sit in her parlor, surrounded by dusty antiques and faded photographs, speaking in cryptic half-sentences that made my foster father Richard roll his eyes. Beatrice always was dramatic, he'd say on the drive home, living in the past, making mountains out of molehills. But I was her only living relative, so when St. Mary's Hospital called at 2 a.m., they called me. "She's asking for you specifically," the nurse said, her voice strained with fatigue. "She's been asking for hours. She doesn't have long, maybe until morning if she's lucky." I threw on clothes and drove 3 hours through a thunderstorm that seemed to mirror the dread building in my chest. Lightning split the sky as I navigated the winding mountain roads to Millbrook, the small town where I'd grown up, where my parents had died, where Richard had built his empire. At the hospital, Beatrice looked tiny in the mechanical bed, her once sharp eyes now clouded with morphine. Her gray hair, which she'd always worn in a severe bun, lay loose across the pillow like spilled silver. But when she saw me, something flickered there. Urgency, fear, desperation. "Vernon," she croaked, gripping my hand with surprising strength. Her fingers were ice cold, but her grip was fierce. "I need to tell you something before I go. Something I should have told you 16 years ago." I pulled the visitor's chair closer to her bed, smelling the antiseptic and approaching death. "What is it, Aunt Beatrice? You're scaring me." "About your parents' accident." My blood went cold. My parents, David and Catherine Morris, had died in a car crash when I was 8. Dad had been driving home from his shift at Coal Industries when their car went off the bridge into Miller's Creek. It was ruled an accident. Brake failure, they said. Random mechanical failure that destroyed my entire world in one night and left me an orphan. "What about it?" I whispered. Beatrice's eyes darted toward the door, making sure we were alone. The heart monitor beeped faster as her pulse quickened. "It wasn't an accident, Vernon. They were murdered." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually felt the air leave my lungs. "What do you mean?" "Your father found something," she said, her voice barely audible. "Documents. About the factory where he worked. They were dumping chemicals into the water supply. Cancer-causing stuff. Poison that was killing children in our town. He was going to blow the whistle." I stared at her, my world tilting on its axis. "You're saying someone killed them to keep them quiet?" "The brake line was cut," she whispered. "I know because I saw it happen. I watched them do it in the factory parking lot." My heart stopped. "You saw it?" Beatrice's grip tightened until her nails dug into my skin. "I was there that night. At the factory. I was supposed to meet your father at midnight. I worked in the billing department. I had the financial records he needed to prove what they were doing to our town. Proof of the illegal dumping, the payoffs to inspectors, everything. Then why didn't you come forward?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why didn't you save them?" Her face crumpled with 16 years of guilt. Tears leaked from her cloudy eyes. "Because they threatened me too. 2 men in expensive suits came to my house the next day. Said if I talked, I'd end up like your parents. So I kept quiet and watched you grow up in foster care, knowing I could have prevented it all. Knowing I was a coward. I couldn't breathe. 16 years of believing my parents died in a random accident. 16 years of therapy to deal with the loss. 16 years of survivor's guilt, wondering why I hadn't been in the car that night. And it was murder. Cold, calculated murder. Who?" I managed to ask. "Who ordered it?" Beatrice looked toward the door again, then back at me with terror in her dying eyes. "The factory owner. But that's not the worst part, Vernon. That's not why I'm finally telling you this." My hands were shaking. "What's the worst part?" She took a ragged breath and I could see her fading with each word. "The factory owner, the man who had your parents killed, is your foster father." The room spun. "Richard Qley, the man who'd taken me in after my parents died, who'd raised me, paid for my college, walked me down the aisle at my wedding just 2 months ago. The man I called Dad." "That's impossible," I whispered. "He adopted you to keep you close," Beatrice said, her voice getting weaker. "To make sure you never started asking questions. What better way to monitor the situation than to raise the victim's child as your own? To make you love him." Every memory of my childhood crashed through my mind. Richard showing up at the funeral in his expensive black suit, kneeling down to my 8-year-old level and promising he'd take care of me. His kindness, his generosity, the way he'd bought me everything I'd ever wanted, the way he'd always deflected when I asked about my parents' accident. "Just focus on the future, son," he'd say. "The past only brings pain." The way he'd held me when I cried about missing my parents. The way he'd taught me to drive. The way he'd walked me down the aisle when Melody and I got married, tears in his eyes as he told me how proud my real father would have been. "But there's more," Beatrice gasped, her breathing becoming labored. "There's a reason I'm telling you this now. Your wife, what about Melody?" I demanded. "She's been asking questions lately, hasn't she? About the water quality in your neighborhood? About the cancer cluster at the elementary school?" My blood turned to ice. Melody was an environmental lawyer who'd recently started her own practice. She'd been investigating a pattern of childhood leukemia cases in our area for months, staying up late, poring over medical records and water quality reports. "How do you know that?" "Because Richard called me last week," Beatrice said, her voice becoming urgent despite her weakness. "Asked if I knew what she was looking into. Asked if you'd ever mentioned your parents to her. I played dumb, but Vernon, the way he talked about her, It was the same tone he used about your father right before. She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I have proof, Beatrice whispered, reaching under her pillow with trembling fingers. She pulled out a small brass key. Safety deposit box. First National Bank downtown. Box 127. Everything's there. The documents your father copied, photos of the cut break line, financial records showing the payoffs to the men who killed them. Why now? I asked, taking the key with numb fingers. Why tell me this now? Because I'm dying, and I can't take this secret with me, she said. And because I think he's planning to do it again. Your wife is getting too close to the truth. I stood up so fast the chair fell over. I have to go. I have to warn her. Wait, Beatrice grabbed my arm with surprising strength. There's something else. In the safety deposit box. A letter your father wrote to you before he died. He suspected something was going to happen. He wanted you to know the truth if anything happened to them. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. Her skin was paper thin and cold. Thank you for telling me. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm so sorry I didn't protect you. I'm sorry I let that monster raise you. You were scared, I said, though part of me wanted to scream at her for staying silent. I understand. Beatrice died that night at 4:17 a.m. I didn't find out until the next morning because I was busy breaking into Richard's home office. I'd driven straight home through the storm, my mind racing. Everything made sense now. Why Richard had been so interested in Melody's work lately. Why he'd suggested she take a vacation to decompress. Why he'd been asking so many questions about her investigation. Why he'd seemed so pleased when she'd mentioned taking on a big case that would require a lot of late nights at the office. He was planning something. I could feel it in my bones. Using the spare key I'd had since college, I let myself into Richard's mansion at 2 a.m. The house was dark. He was away on a business trip to Chicago. Or so he'd said. The place felt different now, knowing what I knew. The oil paintings of landscapes looked sinister. The expensive furniture felt like a facade hiding something rotten underneath. His office was on the second floor, locked, but I remembered where he kept the spare key. Inside the fake book on his shelf. Atlas shrugged. Some habits from my childhood never change. He'd always been predictable in his hiding spots. Inside his mahogany desk, I found a file labeled Environmental Cleanup, Phase 2. My hands shook as I read through it. Maps of our neighborhood, water table diagrams, geological surveys, and a list of names, people who'd been asking questions about the water quality. Melody's name was at the top, circled in red ink, but it was the document underneath that made me physically sick. A proposal to neutralize potential threats to the expansion project. The same cold, corporate language. The same clinical detachment that had probably described my parents' murder as resolving a personnel issue. At the bottom, a handwritten note in Richard's familiar script. Break line method too obvious this time. Suggest home invasion scenario instead. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Below that, contact information for someone named Tony Breslin. The same Tony Breslin who'd been arrested 3 times for assault but never convicted. The same Tony Breslin who worked security for several of Richard's shell companies. My phone buzzed. A text from Richard. Where are you, son? Melody's been in an accident. I'm heading to the hospital now. My blood turned to ice. I looked at the timestamp. The text had been sent 20 minutes ago. I'd been so absorbed in reading the documents that I'd missed it. I called the hospital immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. Millbrook General, how can I help you? My wife, Melody Morris, I got a text that she's been in an accident. One moment, please. The hold music felt like it lasted hours. Finally, a doctor came on the line. Mr. Morris, your wife is in surgery. Someone broke into your house while she was sleeping. She fought back, but she was stabbed multiple times. She's stable, but it's going to be a long surgery. Stabbed? I could barely get the word out. The police are calling it a botched burglary. The perpetrator fled when neighbors called 911 after hearing screams. I knew better. I hung up and called 911. I need to report an attempted murder, I said. The next morning, I drove to First National Bank with Beatrice's key and a head full of rage. I hadn't slept. I'd spent the night at the hospital, holding Melody's hand while she was unconscious, promising her I'd make them pay. The safety deposit box was in the basement vault, box 127. When the bank manager opened it with his master key and my inherited key, I found exactly what Beatrice had promised. Photos of my father's car, clearly showing the severed brake line, not frayed from wear, cut clean through with tools. Financial records showing payments from Coal Industries to Tony Breslin and 2 other men, starting the week before my parents died. Bank statements showing regular deposits into Beatrice's account. Hush money, I realized, to keep her quiet all these years. And at the bottom, wrapped in plastic, a letter in my father's handwriting. Vernon, if you're reading this, then something has happened to your mother and me. I've discovered that Coal Industries has been dumping toxic waste into Miller's Creek for over a decade. The cancer rates in our town are 400% above the national average, especially in children. I have proof, but I'm scared they'll try to stop me from going public. Richard Cole threatened me yesterday, said I was being disloyal to the company, to him personally. He's been like a brother to me for 10 years, but something in his eyes was different, cold, calculating. If something happens to us, know that we loved you more than anything in this world. Don't trust Richard Cole. He's not the man he pretends to be. Find Beatrice Thornton. She has copies of everything. She's scared, but she's good people. Make them pay for what they've done to our town. Make them pay for the children who've gotten sick. And if you're reading this, make them pay for us. All my love, Dad. P.S. Your mother wanted me to tell you that you were the best thing that ever happened to us. You made our lives complete. Remember that. I sat in that bank vault and cried for the first time since I was 8 years old. Then I photocopied everything and drove straight to the FBI field office in the state capitol. Agent Diana Cross was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened to my story with growing alarm. When I showed her the evidence, she immediately placed calls to her supervisor and opened a federal investigation. We've been watching coal industries for months, she admitted. Environmental crimes, possible RICO violations, but we couldn't find anyone willing to testify. Everyone was too scared or too well paid to talk. Well, I'm not scared anymore, I said, and I want that bastard to pay for everything he's done. What about your wife? Is she safe? She's still in surgery. I've got private security watching her room. Agent Cross nodded. Good. We'll need a few days to build our case, but with this evidence, we can move fast. The next week moved like a fever dream. The FBI raided Richard's offices and mansion. They found computer files detailing decades of illegal dumping, bribery, and intimidation. They found contracts with Tony Breslin and his crew for security services that were really just legalized violence. They found Richard's real financial records, showing he'd made hundreds of millions by cutting corners on environmental safety. Most damning of all, they found recent communications between Richard and Breslin planning Melody's murder. Text messages, email drafts, even a recorded phone call where Richard said, "Make sure it looks random. I don't want any connection to her environmental work." When Richard was brought in for questioning, Agent Cross let me watch from behind the one-way mirror. He looked smaller somehow, deflated without his expensive suits and confident swagger. For the first time in my life, I saw him as he really was, not the loving father figure, but a cold-blooded killer who destroyed my family and tried to destroy my wife. Why? Agent Cross asked him. Why adopt the son of the people you had killed? Richard's answer chilled me to the bone. Insurance policy, he said matter-of-factly. Kid grows up grateful, never asks questions. Plus, it looked good for the company image. Grieving businessman takes in orphaned child. Great PR for the annual reports. And when he got married? When his wife started investigating? I thought about handling it differently then, Richard said with a shrug. Maybe it was time for Vernon to have an accident too. Make it look like grief drove him to suicide after losing his wife. 2 birds, 1 stone. Agent Cross slid a photo across the table. This is Vernon watching from the next room. Want to say anything to the boy you raised? Richard looked straight at the mirror. Even though I knew he couldn't see me, I felt like he was staring right through my soul with those cold, calculating eyes I'd somehow never noticed before. You always were too curious for your own good, he said with a slight smile. Just like your father. David never could leave well enough alone. I walked out of that room and never looked back. The trial was a media sensation. Foster father murdered child's real parents, made headlines across the country. Richard's defense team tried everything, claiming the evidence was fabricated, that I was mentally unstable, that this was all an elaborate revenge fantasy. But the evidence was overwhelming. Tony Breslin, facing life in prison, cut a deal and testified against Richard in excruciating detail. He described how Richard had hired him to sabotage my parents' car, how they'd made it look like an accident, how Richard had paid him to intimidate witnesses and potential whistleblowers over the years. The most devastating testimony came from Dr. Patricia Huang, the oncologist who'd been treating the children with leukemia in our town. She'd been documenting the cancer cluster for years, but had been pressured by the hospital board, led by Richard's cronies, to keep quiet. Mr. Cole personally came to my office, she testified. He said my research was causing unnecessary panic. He offered to fund a new children's wing at the hospital if I would discontinue my study. When I refused, I started receiving death threats. During cross-examination, Richard's lawyer tried to paint me as an unreliable narrator, someone who'd constructed an elaborate fantasy to deal with childhood trauma. But when they put me on the stand, I was ready. Mr. Morris, Richard's lawyer said, isn't it true that you've idealized your biological parents? That you might have created this conspiracy theory to explain their death rather than accept it was a random accident? I looked at Richard sitting at the defendant's table. He was staring at me with those cold eyes, probably expecting me to break down. No, I said clearly. What's true is that the man I called Dad for 16 years murdered my real parents in cold blood. What's true is that he raised me as a trophy, a symbol of his own fake benevolence. What's true is that he tried to murder my wife when she got too close to exposing his crimes. But you loved him, didn't you? He was good to you. I paused, thinking about all the birthdays, the Christmas mornings, the father-son talks, the way he'd hugged me when I graduated college. I loved a lie, I said finally. I loved a mask he wore to hide the fact that he was a monster. Every kindness was manipulation. Every hug was a reminder that he owned me, that he'd won. And you're not bitter about that? Not angry enough to fabricate evidence? I looked directly at Richard. I'm not fabricating anything. The evidence speaks for itself. My father documented Richard's crimes before he died. Beatrice Thornton kept copies for 16 years. The FBI found current plans to kill my wife. None of that is fabricated. It's just the truth finally coming to light. Richard was convicted on all counts. 2 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, environmental crimes, racketeering, bribery, and witness intimidation. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tony Breslin got 25 years for his cooperation, though he'd been the one who actually cut the brake lines. The coal industry's cleanup cost $2.3 billion. The company declared bankruptcy and its assets were liquidated to pay for environmental remediation and victim compensation. 17 families, including mine, received settlements for wrongful death and environmental damage. But the money couldn't bring back my parents. It couldn't erase 16 years of loving my parents' killer. It couldn't undo the psychological damage of being raised by a sociopath who saw me as a pet project. Melody recovered fully, though she still has nightmares about the attack. The doctor said if she hadn't fought back as hard as she did, if the neighbors hadn't called 911 so quickly, she wouldn't have survived. Tony Breslin had been instructed to make sure she died. We moved across the country to Portland, where Melody started her own environmental law firm specializing in cases against corporate polluters. She wanted to honor my parents' memory by finishing the work they'd started. Her practice, Morris Environmental Justice, has won dozens of cases against companies that prioritize profits over public health. I became an investigative journalist, focusing on corporate crime and corruption. My first book, The Foster Father: A True Story of Murder and Deception, became a bestseller. All the proceeds went to environmental justice organizations and cancer research. But success couldn't fill the hole in my chest. For months after the trial, I struggled with identity issues. Who was I if not Richard Cole's grateful son? What did it mean that every childhood memory was tainted with the knowledge of what he really was? I started therapy with Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in complex trauma. She helped me understand that my love for Richard had been real, even if he wasn't. That grieving the loss of the father figure I'd thought he wasn't betraying my real parents. You were a child, she reminded me during one particularly difficult session. You needed love and safety, and you created emotional bonds with the person providing those things. That's normal human psychology. It doesn't make you weak or naive. But how could I not know? I asked. How could I live with him for 16 years and not see what he really was? Because he was very good at hiding it, she said. Sociopaths often are. They know exactly what mask to wear to get what they want. He wanted you to love him, so he became lovable. It wasn't real, but your feelings were. The hardest part was visiting my parents' grave for the first time since learning the truth. Their headstone reads, David and Catherine Morris. Loving parents, taken too soon. I'd always thought that meant taken by fate, by bad luck. Now I knew it meant taken by evil. I knelt between their graves and told them everything. How Richard had raised me, how he'd tried to kill Melody, how we'd brought him to justice, how their evidence had finally exposed the truth. I'm sorry it took so long, I whispered. I'm sorry I loved him. I'm sorry I didn't know. The wind rustled through the oak tree above their graves, and for just a moment I felt like they were there with me, like they understood. A year after the trial, I got a letter from Richard in prison. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity won out. Vernon, it read in his familiar handwriting, I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't expect you to, but I want you to know that despite everything, I was proud of you. You turned out to be exactly the man your father would have wanted you to be. Strong, principled, unwilling to let injustice stand. I know it probably doesn't matter to you, but in my own way, I did love you. Not enough to tell you the truth, not enough to spare you pain, but more than I've ever loved anyone else. You were the one good thing in my life, even if I had no right to you. Your father was right to try to expose what I was doing. He was a better man than I ever was. I'm glad you're more like him than like me. I hope someday you can remember some of our good times without hating yourself for it. You deserved better than what I gave you. Richard. I read the letter 3 times, then burned it in our fireplace. Melody found me there an hour later, staring at the ashes. What was that? She asked, sitting beside me. A reminder that monsters can love too, I said. It doesn't make them less monstrous. She took my hand. Do you believe him? That he loved you? I thought about it for a long time. I think he loved the idea of me. The perfect son who would never question him, never challenge him, never threaten his secrets. He loved owning me. But real love? Real love wouldn't have let him put me through 16 years of lies. Last month, I got a call from Agent Cross. Richard had died in prison. Heart attack. Brought on by the stress of multiple appeals and the constant fear of retaliation from other inmates who didn't appreciate child killers. I thought you should know, she said. How do you feel about it? I realized I felt nothing. No relief, no sadness, no closure. Just emptiness where complicated feelings used to be. I feel like a chapter is ending, I told her. But the story isn't over. And it isn't. Melody and I have helped dozens of families affected by corporate environmental crimes. We've exposed companies that prioritize profits over human life. We've helped change laws to protect whistleblowers and strengthen environmental regulations. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if my real parents had lived. Would my father have successfully exposed coal industries in 1995? Would we have remained a happy family in our small house by Miller's Creek? Would I have become a teacher like my mother or an engineer like my father? But then I look at Melody, at the families we've helped through her law firm, at the corporate polluters we've brought to justice, and I realized that maybe this was always my path. Maybe losing my parents, growing up with their killer, discovering the truth, maybe it all led me to exactly where I needed to be. I still visit Beatrice's grave every year on the anniversary of her death. Her headstone reads, Beatrice Thornton. She found the courage to tell the truth. I tell her about our latest cases, the communities we've helped, the corporations we've held accountable. Thank you, I always say before I leave. Thank you for finding the courage to speak up when it mattered. Because sometimes the most shocking confession isn't just about the past. Sometimes it's about the future you never knew you were meant to have. Sometimes it's about learning that the people who hurt you don't get to define you. That truth has its own power. That justice delayed isn't always justice denied. My parents died fighting for the truth. Beatrice lived with that truth for 16 years before finding the courage to share it. And now Melody and I carry that torch forward, making sure their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Richard Cole thought he could bury the truth with my parents. He thought he could control me by raising me as his own. He thought he could eliminate any threat to his empire. He was wrong about all of it. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury it. Love, real love, is stronger than manipulation. And sometimes the children of victims grow up to become the instruments of justice. That's not the ending Richard wrote for me, but it's the ending I chose for myself.